My name is Blake Norton. I am the curator here for the Cultural Center. I'm going to be presenting a paper today called Seganok or Blackbird. It's a paper that I presented a few years back at the bicentennial of Tecumseh's death at Walpole Island. It seemed to go over pretty well there, so I thought I would share it with you guys. So on the balmy morning of August 15th, 1812, the gates of Fort Dearborn opened, and a nervous parade of its inhabitants began to evacuate. The evacuation was a direct order handed down to the fort's commander, Nathaniel Held, by U.S. General William Hull, stationed at Detroit. Hull's insistence to hastily evacuate the post came with the defeat of Fort Mackinac, Dearborn's major supply repository. The migrating party, totaling 96, consisted of military regulars, militia, and their families. Escorting the party was a small band of Miami warriors led by William Wells, famed son-in-law to the prominent Miami headman Little Turtle and commander of Fort Wayne, the immigrating party's destination. As they traveled south along the shore of Lake Michigan, they were unknowingly pursued by a war party of over 500, made up of Kickapoo, Sauk, Ho-Chunk, and Potawatomi. For over a mile, the war party led by Seganok, translated as Blackbird, intently hid behind the sand dunes peppering the shores of the lake, preparing their weapons for an attack. With the signal given, swarms of warriors poured over the dunes, cutting the parade in half with gunfire. In an attempt to counter, Wells and Held ordered their troops to engage the center of the attacking warriors, hoping a sweeping volley would repel them back over the dunes. However, the number of the attackers was far too great. As more and more flooded from the sand, the American flanks fell, and the rear of the column was attacked. With the main force of American troops defeated, the warriors moved toward the wagons of civilians, protected only by a handful of militia. In a fierce bout of hand-to-hand combat, the remaining defenders fell. With this victory secured, Blackbird would soon meet with Held to arrange a truce and negotiate prisoner exchange, each survivor carrying a ransom of $100, a large sum at that time. When the negotiations ended, Blackbird and his warriors returned to the battlefield to perform a ceremony common to warriors of the Northwest. Respected for his military prowess, the Captain Dead Wells' heart was cut out and distributed amongst Blackbird's party to eat. It was thought that by consuming one's enemy, their power could be obtained. Rounding up their valuable captives, Blackbird and his troops marched back to Fort Dearborn amongst a sea of fallen and dismembered bodies to collect more retribution. Despite agreeing to Held's terms for prisoner release, the Intertribal War Party continued to kill their captives, motivating local neutral Potawatomi to come to their aid. The decisive victory, a battle won in less than half an hour, culminated with the sacking and burning of the abandoned fort. Triumphant, Blackbird and a platoon of his warriors departed south to align with Potawatomi from the St. Joseph region, who had just simultaneously conquered Detroit, and to plan their next attack, the siege of Fort Wayne. Seganok the Elder. Descending from leadership, where Blackbird excelled on the battlefield, his father's prowess was oration and diplomacy. Seganok the Elder, an Ogama from Milwaukee, dominated councils among the powerful Muscodan of western Lake Michigan. Given his position as an opportune conduit to northern Anishinaabeg Confederates, he was continually courted by both British and American delegates during the Revolutionary War, in hopes of rallying forces to a cohesive cause. Despite regularly receiving lavish gifts, he adamantly stayed neutral. His firm stance for keeping the peace, a position that alienated him from more militant bands, was never misconstrued as weakness. His seemingly imperial convictions were a sign of his steadfast indifference to English strong-arm tactics, of use of Iroquois muscle to force them into an alliance, threats that proved to be somewhat legitimate to the Detroit and St. Joseph Potawatomi. However, with the victorious occupation of Illinois, a display of American power by the hand of Kentucky militia leader George Rogers Clark and his battalion of 175 volunteers, Seganok's patience in the war began to waver, and he became increasingly interested in the American stance. Attesting his position as a peacekeeper, Seganok the Elder attended the 1778 Intertribal Conference at Cahokia, where he and Clark were granted the opportunity to understand each other's positions. Informing Clark that he was not concerned with elaborate ceremonies and was well acquainted with Britain's policies, he welcomed the opportunity to hear the American point of view. Upon meeting with the Milwaukee leader for several hours, Clark described the headman as a polite gentleman who spoke as much in the European manner as possible. In a show of mutual respect, when their council was over, Clark gifted the elder Seganok 2 horses and numerous gifts, and the headman accepted. Initially being intrigued, their meeting became the catalyst to the only known belligerence committed by Seganok during the American Revolution. Angered by the amount of influence British traders had over his St. Joseph kinsmen and heeding their pleas for help, Seganok knew that his meeting with Clark 2 years before was enough to keep the U.S. at bay, and petitioned his old ally, Spanish Louisiana, to aid in an attack to overthrow the English occupation of the river valley and subdue growing interests and threats of an attack on St. Louis. His pleas did not fall on deaf ears. On February 12, 1781, Spanish Captain Eugene Poré and 65 soldiers, along with Seganok, Windstriker, and a force of 73 Fires warriors, attacked St. Joseph. Capturing the post in a matter of minutes, the fort was claimed in the name of Spain, and the trade goods were then dispersed among the local Potawatomi. Victorious, the Spanish and Anishinaabe force returned to St. Louis, leaving Fort St. Joseph to the vices of the locals. With his mission complete and his position as Ogama cemented, Seganok the Elder put his weapons away for good and returned to his position of diplomacy. A new legacy. In an effort to prove his position as a warrior and step out from the peaceful shadow of his father, Blackbird, nearly 18 years of age, decided to denounce the Elder's policies and create his own legacy. Blackbird and his comrade Mad Sturgeon, a young warrior of the prominent Fish clan, enlisted to fight in the Spanish Osage War of 1793. Intent on protecting the bustling Creole commerce of the Louisiana Territory from Osage incursions, Spanish officials tapped into the traditional Osage-Potawatomi blood feud, pleading with the firekeepers to take up the war club against their old enemies. Intent on counting traditional coup in the relative peacetime after the Battle of Fallen Timbers and resulting Treaty of Greenville, young Potawatomi anxiously crossed over the Mississippi to engage in a warrior's rite of passage. Not known for restraint, the young Blackbird's exploits during the bloody campaigns caught the attention of Mad Sturgeon's brother-in-law, famed warrior in Wabano, Maine Pock. A large and imposing Potawatomi from the Lake Peoria region of Illinois, Maine Pock was well known for his strong medicine and abilities to converse with spirits. As a Wabano, Maine Pock would describe his abilities to shapeshift into powerful animals, prowling and attacking his enemies at night. Such men, including Maine Pock, were employed either for protection or more malevolent reasons. Furthering his mystique, the powerful warrior was born without fingers on his left hand, a deformity he touted as a symbol of power from the Creator. It was meant to distinguish him from commoners when the Creator looked upon the earth. Translated as cut or withered hand, referencing his divine abnormality, Maine Pock was considered to be one of the most powerful spiritualists of his time, only rivaled by the Shawnee prophet Tenskwatawa. In 1807, the Shawnee prophet's new faith reached Maine Pock and other Illinois Potawatomi. With a reputation preceding him, the famed Shawnee warrior Tecumseh and his brother Tenskwatawa were intent on meeting the esteemed Wabano. That fall, Maine Pock and his lieutenants Mad Sturgeon and Blackbird were invited to confer with Tecumseh and the prophet at their village near Greensville, Ohio. Resulting from the 2-month visit was a pact between the Shawnee and the Potawatomi, an invitation for the prophet to move his village to Indiana. The move would centralize the spiritual war leader's efforts and allow for protection under Maine Pock's watch. With an agreement made, the Potawatomi left Ohio and headed west to their winter villages. As they passed through Fort Wayne, the three were intercepted by the fort's commander, William Wells. In a rare opportunity, the captain wooed the Potawatomi warriors in supplies of food and extravagant gifts in the hopes of refuting the words of the Shawnee and gaining a Potawatomi alliance for the United States. Still unsure of Maine Pock's, Mad Sturgeon's, and Blackbird's convictions, William Wells invited the party along with their wives to visit the president in Washington. The trip was an attempt to intimidate the influential warriors with the industrious nature and large populations of the eastern states. In December 1808, the three met personally with Thomas Jefferson, as he had urged them to become agriculturalists and assured them of the United States' interest in their well-being. Despite the intentions of the trip, it only served as reconnaissance into the heart of the enemy. Blackbird the warrior. Eclipsed by both his predecessors and contemporaries, Blackbird's role as a key player in the War of 1812 cannot be contested. Despite his absence from the majority of records recounting this pivotal time, it's those few that do exist describing his defense of Prophetstown, leadership at the Battle of Fort Dearborn, and stand at Frenchtown that bring the man to life. At Prophetstown, he was among the Illinois warriors personally called to arms by the Shawnee Prophet. In an attempt to strike at the heart of the nativist movement, William Henry Harrison, governor of the Indiana Territory, and nearly 1,000 troops made up of infantry, cavalry, and militia descended upon Prophetstown. This audacious move was spurred by reports of Tecumseh's absence, enlisting forces from the southeast. Tenskwatawa watched as Harrison's forces drew closer, sending runners to parley with the Americans. Exhausted from their march, Harrison decided to camp for the night and leave discussions for the next day. Realizing that they were outnumbered, the Potawatomi, also led by Wabunzi, Winnemac, and Shebney, and hundreds of Shawnee, Kickapoo, Ho-Chunk, Odawa, and Wyandotte encamped within the palisade, initiated a preemptive attack on their enemies. While sneaking into the American camp just before dawn on November 7, 1811, they were spotted by a guard and fired upon. Initially, the native company inflicted heavy losses, but were quickly overtaken in the relatively short battle. Exuding dominance in what he considered a complete and decisive victory, Harrison remained on the battlefield and in the vicinity of Prophetstown for 2 days, as the native stronghold and subsequent supplies were looted and destroyed by fire. The defeat at Prophetstown only enraged Blackbird and other Potawatomi. Losing nearly 200 kinsmen, the warriors returned to the plains of Illinois to collect American scalps and goods owed to them for their dead. 2 years later, with American forces controlling northern Ohio and making preparations to move on the British stronghold of Detroit, thousands of nativist warriors migrated north to repel the American front. On January 18, 1813, U.S. General James Winchester arrived at the Maumee River in preparation for an attack on Detroit. Receiving reports that a small mixed force of native and British troops were at nearby Frenchtown, Winchester disobeyed the orders of his commander, William Henry Harrison, and ordered an attack. One quickly came by the Americans, who continued to nearby River Raisin. When the news of the attack reached British Commander Henry Proctor, nearly 1,500 troops, including Blackbird, are ordered to engage Winchester. In a short but feverish battle, the British and their native allies gained control of the river. Upon Winchester's surrender, he attempts to negotiate the security of the fallen and imprisoned troops, a desperate and failed hope. Reminiscent of his actions at Fort Dearborn and the fall of Prophetstown, the unwavered Blackbird and party of 3 Fires and Lenape warriors began killing the wounded Americans left on the battlefield, while others were taken captive and ransomed from nearby villages. A warrior's legacy. In later years, Blackbird, a complex historical figure, exhibits the dual nature of his character by adopting the diplomatic strengths of his father. Working with his enemies to find a resolution, his name can be found among the treaties and compacts penned between the United States and Potawatomi Nation. Successfully developing a complex social and cultural blending of Native and Anglo ideals, Blackbird, now in his 60s and recognized as Benak, or more formally Stephen Benak, lived quietly as a nominal Catholic and prominent landowner until his death in 1855. In contrast to Leopold Pokagon's efforts to evade removal through his relationship with the Catholic Church, Blackbird's commercial accomplishments and associates secured permanent roots for him in Indiana. Despite his seemingly acculturated lifestyle, Blackbird's disdain for Anglo-Americans remained. Early settlers of Indiana were aware of his youthful exploits and remained cautious of the aging Potawatomi. Local conjecture stated that Benek had the tongues of 99 whites and that he vowed to have an even 100. Blackbird's legacy as a fierce warrior cannot be overshadowed, a fact he eloquently summed up in an 1813 debriefing conducted by the British Indian Department. The contentious nature of that meeting was in response to the British's reproach of Blackbird's brutal tactics during the War of 1812, despite awarding him a Medal of Honor for an assault on Fort Dearborn less than a year before. What the Crown's officials continually failed to understand is that Blackbird and his intertribal alliance were not merely grunts to the British or any other foreign cause, but belligerents of another nature who fought not only to repulse, but collect retribution of nearly 200 years of unabated Anglo encroachment on their homeland. An eye for an eye, it was a fight begun by their fathers and deserving of an end at their hands.